everybody. Welcome. I'll now call to order this work session. We're here today to discuss AO 2024-104S, which is an ordinance of the Anchorage Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code Title 21 to reduce the cost and burden of multifamily residential developments by suspending the residential design standards for development applications submitted within a certain time. Before we dive in, we'll go ahead and do introductions, starting with Mr. Salt.
Randy Solt here.
Mark Littlefield. Scott Myers.
Karen Bronga.
Zach Johnson.
Exalato.
Daniel Volin.
Christopher Constant.
Felix Vera.
All right, I think Anna Burley said that without the mic on, but that's okay. So today we have this ordinance. Before we get there, I'll hand the mic to Mr. Myers.
Just need to make a disclosure that I represent Cook Inlet Housing Authority and work with Mr. Robinson on a semi-annual basis. So, but it has nothing to do with this AO.
Right. There's nothing actionable there or here. Just worth putting in the record. If anybody has any objections, there is no personal or financial interest related to this item. Hearing no objection, we'll move on. I do not have the run of show for this. I think I'm going to hand it off to Ms. Brawley. Or Ms. Zalato.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the moratorium on multifamily design standards, which is before you, I'm just going to give you where it came from, and then Anna is going to talk you through the ordinance. And then we have Mr. Robinson from Cook Inlet to talk a little bit about the implications and the impacts. So this project came out of the home initiative. So as we did the home initiative and we were talking about zoning, time after time after time, we talked to developers and builders. They said, great, you can do that. And would you really take a close look at multifamily design standards? And they would share instance after instance where a multifamily design standard became an impediment either to moving a project forward in a reasonable way, or required extra costs, or required a unit reduction in order to meet the design standards. So in the Assembly's priority on housing and to get more units of housing, and now a shared priority with the administration, the intention here is to get out of our own way for a period of time, collect data on what works, what doesn't work, and then have a ongoing conversation about what residential design standards should be in place. Please note, and we'll get into this with the ordinance, is that this does nothing to Title 23. It does nothing to building health and safety requirements under Title 23. And a number of things that people are concerned about are actually covered, like landscaping or other things, are covered in other parts of code that aren't necessarily a multifamily residential design standard. So with that, want to also give just a huge shout out to Ms. Brawley, my co-sponsor. She has done some considerable community engagement on this and prepared a number of materials. So I just want to acknowledge that work. Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll also give a shout out to Ms. Hartman, who helped in that endeavor as well. And then also recognizing we have Mr. Sean Debenham here, another developer from the kind of private sector side, not the nonprofit side. And so he is also going to speak to this as well. So I'll briefly go through our slides. This is a little bit of the same territory we covered in CEDC yesterday. So I'll just but I want to make sure we're all grounded, because I know we're not all in that meeting. And then we can move on to really hearing from the folks who use these codes every day to speak to impacts and be able to answer questions. And then I'll also note, I see we have a couple of folks from the planning department in the back. So they presented yesterday. I'll briefly touch on their findings in the recommendation report, what we're planning to do with them. And then beyond that, I think if there's technical questions, we could call them up. So I'll move on to the next slide. There we go. So again, just to ground us, the housing shortage is an ongoing issue. Thank you. And so it didn't start with COVID. It didn't even start with our, adopting new zoning regulations. But we can at least trace back one piece that is relevant, which is in 2012, there was a housing report or housing market analysis, I think was the term, that found that basically mid-rise and larger multifamily housing. So not just rental, not just affordable, also condos, any kind of building that has a bunch of housing units in it is not feasible to build without subsidy. Essentially, the market will not produce that on its own. And that really has been true since then. I think there's been multiple analyses that have proved that out. And so really just to ground us, that is the situation we're in and have been in for many years. Nextly, I know we've seen this graphic before. We really want to emphasize that what we're talking about is the yellow pieces of this graphic. So you'll see this is permitted units, not necessarily what's been built. Of course, there's been a whole project to figure out how we count how many units have been built and how we do that going forward. But please note that the dark blue, the single family, of course, the production's been low for many years overall, but the single family one is down, but it's still pretty healthy. The thing that we really need to look at is that multi-unit housing, especially if that's total number of units, not just total number of projects. Biggest area of need in our community. So just again, this is where we're really focusing on multifamily and how to unlock more housing production. So this is a fun little graphic. And again, I don't want to conflate quantity and quality of our codes, but we just want to note Title 21 has grown considerably over time. So it started with 80 pages in the 70s, and now it's over 900 pages. Again, I'm not commenting that we don't need a bunch of those pages, that it's not valuable to have regulations, but just to note, this, I would guess, is probably the biggest chapter in our code by far. Maybe I'm wrong. It's got to be in the top 5 at least. And a big chunk of that is, not all of it, but is things like these design standards. So I'll just briefly explain the ordinance, and I am covering the same ground as we did yesterday, but for the most part, we're talking about rules for what buildings look like with 5 or more units, whether it's an apartment complex, one building, whatever it is, 5 or more units. So just to be clear, we're not talking about fourplexes. We're not talking about duplexes. So the sections that are being paused are listed here. Again, there's an entire chapter of residential design standards overall, Chapter 7 in Title 21. These are the specific sections that are being paused. So to Member Zolotel's point, we're not pausing the whole chapter. We're not pausing a number of the rules that still exist in place, like landscaping, really looking at these sections. And so I'll note that there's the 2107, 110 sections there, and the next slide gets into a little more detail, but also part of what we call pedestrian frontage or site access is the short term. And then we can get into kind of, there's the separate project regarding site access. We can talk about how those interact, but this proposes pausing them again for multifamily housing. Site access also does apply to commercial properties and other properties. So again, we're really, again, focused on multifamily housing. So this would be paused for 3 years until January 2028. The projects, in order to qualify, would have to be substantially, there's certain thresholds in the ordinance that say you can lock in these rules or these entitlements if you meet this certain threshold by the deadline. If you are get a project approved in 2027 and then it gets to be built in 2028, 2029, those would still lock in. So there wouldn't be a sudden kind of pull back and say, okay, all of a sudden you've already got these approved. Now you have to meet these new standards again. So the goal is really to create a window in which people can operate. It also has a required annual reporting from the planning department on how these are being utilized, analysis of impacts. Really, we want to make sure that we're looking at the data that this will provide. We hope that we'll see more projects and that we can use that in order to really evaluate what these standards should be going forward. So really the premise here is, why would we continue doing something that we believe is not working? And instead, why don't we pause it and use it as an opportunity to study and then create better standards? And that's really what we have already been in the process of with site access. So again, what does it do? What does it do not do? There you'll see the list of specific items because the ordinance doesn't list out every single submenu, but I do want to note, and sorry, the arrow's a little bit off. You'll see that landscaping is listed there, C7, but there is also a separate section. Again, this is getting to probably why our code is 900 pages. A separate section that's called landscaping, screening, and fences that is not being paused. Similarly with private open space, there is a reference to that in these sections being paused, and there is also a separate section called private open space. And I see there's a couple questions.
Start with Ms. Braga, then Mr. Boland, then I think it was Mr. Salt. Go ahead, Ms. Braga.
On the previous slide, I was a little confused. The second one said something about single multifamily, 1 to 5, but the title of the slide says 5 units and above. So can you explain what that is about?
Yeah, I'll just briefly go back. So and I think you're referring there to 110D. So that part of the code deals with really when you're planning out a mixed housing subdivision. So let's say you've got single family, some attached housing, some other pieces. There's a requirement that you have to have multiple housing models so that you wouldn't copy paste the same building and a couple other rules there. But really, for the most part, these already do not apply to single family housing, or really up to 4 units. That's the only section that really does touch those other housing types. And then I would also suggest maybe the developers could speak to that either now or maybe we wait till their portion.
Mr. Boland.
Thank you. So on the last slide that you just presented on with what it does and what it doesn't do. So those landscaping standards in those two sections, are they pretty duplicative, or is one more flexible than the other? Is one more stringent in terms of where it is in Title 21?
I think that might actually be best answered by staff, or I could have Mr. Robinson, because I don't want to make proclamations about code that I don't deal with every day.
Yeah, is staff prepared to answer that? Or have
And
any
I can
insight?
start, if I may, through the chair. My read of this section of code was it was very specific to how you're dealing with driveways and landscaping between townhouse units. And frankly, as you looked at it, it was in conflict with the site access ordinance that was passed. So our approach of putting it in there is we missed it when the site access went in there. Therefore, it should be looked at as part of site access and sort of reintroduced, rather than kind of in this really odd section where you don't typically look for landscaping requirements. That was my view.
I would note that was Mr. Robinson for the record. Melissa Babb, the planning director, you want to add?
Lisa Babb, Planning Department. Through the chair, I believe that what Tyler said was correct. I think there may be some small additional requirements for large multifamily buildings in that section of code that would be affected, but they would be small foundational landscape beds. Whereas the landscape code in place at the moment would still require multifamily to have all of the site perimeter landscaping, the parking lot landscaping, everything that all of the other developments in town would be required to have as well.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
All right, next, Mr. Salt.
Thank you. My question's with regards to pedestrian frontage standards. I think I understand it, but if you could explain that, and then also if any of this has impact on snow storage. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I will briefly answer and then again throw it to the experts. You'll note that it lists pedestrian frontage standards number 1, number 2, and then the actual section number 3. Those are basically cross references that all referred back to the same section, but the pedestrian frontage, I think I'll mostly throw to our other folks, but really that is what we refer to as site access, and then those other 2 are those cross references.
Tyler Robinson again, through the chair. The site access pedestrian frontage standards, and I'll have an example a little bit later, but it's stuff we've been talking about since this came into effect January 1 of 2024. And so it's relatively new code. It came after the work that you did on the triplex, fourplex work, and it applied across the board to everything in Anchorage. Our belief, and it became part of the mayor's transition team report, was that it was not thoroughly vetted or tested. It resulted in the vast majority of our projects no longer meeting the code, and projects that we had in design no longer meeting the code. There is an active working group right now led by Melissa and her staff to revise that section. That you've already taken action to exempt some of its influence. What we're doing here is sort of clarifying that exemption should go out farther, just to make sure that a project that I have in design that isn't just coming in for permit this year, but next year, would not be tripped up by this section of code. So I think it's an already recognized problem that is being worked on. We're just clarifying, hey, I've got projects that are 2-3 years out. Let me move forward with certainty with those projects.
All right. I was told by the sponsor there's a couple more slides. I have a question on one of the slides, but I think I can probably wait. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, because I know we want to kind of get into the meat of this. So, well, actually, I'll just briefly say here, what does not do, it does not remove or change code. Really, again, the idea is to pause the code and have the fuller discussion with the benefit of time and data to look at that. And it doesn't change any of the underlying zoning districts, use table, right? All the other pieces of zoning code. So this is kind of where we're almost ending. Two distinct questions are before us, I think. Should Anchorage have residential? And I want to, because we're introducing this to really separate these two ideas. Should Anchorage have residential design standards? We know that our plans call for them, and I put the language of the code or the plan because it calls for design standards that sustain economic viability and growth and promote development. So the question is really, are our standards right now meeting those goals? And my assertion would be that it's not. And so this is why the idea of pausing what we have in code is not rejecting the idea that we should have standards. It is really stepping back and saying, are these working and can we make them work better? So I just, again, want to, because it's easy to conflate those two questions, I want to put those out there very specifically. And then lastly, the department did produce a memo. They can speak to those recommendations, but they recommended approval of this with 3 additional items. The first one is to extend the date. They were responding to the original version that had a 2-year pause. They recommend changing it to May 2028 instead of what we have now, January 2028. So we are going to run an amendment to that effect. The second one is to convene a working group. Again, we can talk in more detail about the site access experience that is in process. But the goal here is, again, to use the data that this would provide, real world data, in order to convene a process that is collaborative, that is working with the community and developers and the experts to do that. So we're also bringing, or at least I plan to bring a floor amendment to that intent, not directing exactly when it happens, who's leading it, et cetera, just really that needs to happen. And then the last one is updating policy guidance in our plans. That is also something already in process that planning could speak to. So then I'll just say it's on our agenda for Tuesday. This is for the public, just how you can sign up to testify. And that is the end of our presentation. So I can pull back other
Yes,
slides.
I have myself in the queue. Would you go back to the slide, the kind of units over years? That one. So just for the members' benefit who are newer to the question, obviously you note the spike that is that vastly higher number of units, and then the little call outs in red, new Title 21 adopted and then fully implemented. I think it's safe to say that the reason that happened is that the developers and builders had their plans in the can and they were ready to go, and they wanted to get them built as quickly as they could in the face of a new and untested code so that they could ensure that their building stock would be buildable and affordable and everything else. And so the spike there was because of the Title 21 update. And that 2-year period was when we went from you could choose your code to you had to use the new Title 21, which clearly had an impact. And I can remember my first conversation ever with Mr. Myers. I think it was in that line between 2016 and 2017, in which he said plainly to me, please support the ending the new Title 21 and going back to the old Title 21. And so I can hear those words now. Yeah. And so many, many years ago now. And so I just want to put that out there, that that's the why for those who might have looked at that and wondered. So now open floor.
Yeah, thank you. And then I'll turn to, I think our friends, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Debenham, to speak to kind of what this means for you.
Thank you, Member Brawley, Mr. Chair and members. I have about, my name's Tyler Robinson. I'm the Vice President of Community Development and Real Estate with Cook Inlet Housing Authority. I have about 10 minutes of walking you through. There's a couple of images, hopefully provide some examples. They're recent examples, as I've heard. We go through a lot more examples, but trying to put some color onto what the impact of this is. We know that we're greatly underproducing the number of housing units that we call for in our comp plan. At the lower end of our comp plan, it calls for 800 to 1,000 units a year. You can see from those lower level bar chart graphs, we're hovering around 30% of those numbers over the past 10 years. But multifamily in particular is nowhere near our targets. We're about 130 of those units per year over the past 10 years. And by our estimation, Cook Inlet Housing has built 50% of those multifamily units over the past 10 years. I say that to say we have a lot of experience using this code, but I also mean to say That's not a good thing. When your affordable housing provider is producing half of your multifamily housing, that's not what you want to realize the goals of our comp plan. I don't see support for staying the course, and starting a process to review and edit and tweak these standards around the edges would not see changes for 2 to 3 building seasons. We can't afford that. This proposed moratorium allows us to try to move the needle while we come up with a process to replace them with common sense standards that support new housing. First, some general comments. Design guidelines exist in other communities, and when we've reviewed them, we see some trends. First of all, they're located all in one section of code. The fact that this ordinance jumps around is indicative of the fact that we haven't put them organized and in one place. Second, they're written in much simpler terms, and they're often the overall section is shorter. They usually apply to all development types, not just multifamily housing. When you're trying to impact what a community looks like, you don't pick out one use type only. And finally, usually the context in which they apply is usually pretty clear. And we have examples of this in town, right? We have a downtown code, we have a Girdwood code, clearly recognizes that the context of those areas is different. But then we have a catch-all for the rest of the bowl in Eagle River and Chugiak. And frankly, just as you go from one section of town to the other, the context changes drastically. I've been asked to provide some examples of the impacts of these sections. I'm going to jump around. Again, what this ordinance does is affects about 20 pages of a 140-page Chapter 7. And Chapter 7 is, of course, one chapter within Title 21. So these are 20 pages, and I'm going to go through a few examples. One is on that site access example. Again, well-meaning, but effective January 2024. What I really want to emphasize to this body and the public at large is this was new. This is new. This is brand new stuff. When we first came to understand what this ordinance did in late 2023, we said, holy cow, the projects we have in design won't meet it. It's likely, whether it's big, this went from single family to duplex to townhouse to multifamily. And we affirmed that by conversations with the planning department. We've been coming to you, planning commission. We use it as a campaign issue. We believe there's a common sense way to fix that site access. And I think you'll see scheduled at the Planning Commission in March, the beginnings of the proposal to fix that standard. Second section I would really want to talk a little bit about is the building articulation menu, which is 110C5 in this big book. Feel free to follow along if you want. But these standards only apply to larger residential buildings, not to similarly sized offices, hotels, medical facilities. And these standards force a sort of check the box design philosophy that adds cost without measurable impact to the public. Generally, this section requires foundation jogs. This going, as you see a building do this, upper story step backs. So the upper story might be stepped back from a lower story. Additional windows, modulations, articulations of facades, roof lines, entries, etc. In addition to making many of our buildings look the same, you can sort of trace when Title 21 became effective because many of our buildings start to look very similar. These exterior jogs are super expensive, but it also, what I want to remind people is it affects how we program the interior of our units. If your jog, imagine an office building that had to do this and walking down the hall. Why does that guy get a bigger office than me? Well, because we had to jog the building as we went down the hall. But it affects our programming as we are forced to deliver identically sized units due to our funding requirements. We now have to adjust and actually in some cases take away space that we're building in a unit. We build more square footage but can't actually use it as rentable space. There is a picture on the slides here of Chibala Corners, West 36th. I don't know if it's going to end up on the screen, but there are two pictures about that development. The example, and you can see by looking at it, you can see the articulation, the step back, the change of materials, the change of colors. What I want to talk to you about is one of the other choices. So those choices alone weren't enough for us to approve, get that project through. In addition, we were forced to pick another of the least worst choices, and that was additional window square footage or percentage of overall facade. What that effectively did in the name of a more attractive building or having eyes on the street is require us to have a 3-by-5-foot window in a ground floor bathroom and a full height window in a main entry door on 36th Avenue. Rather than eyes on the street, our residents have covered these windows, some colorfully, I'll see, or seasonally, because they feel like they're living in a fishbowl. What this section has done is it has made, in this instance, both being more expensive and less livable. The next two pictures on the next page are our Brewster's project, a brownfield site in Mountain View. Super challenging project to put on due to access, due to the fact that there was contamination. We included the Brewster's letters, which were the original letters, and a mural designed by a local artist. Those received, I think, no actual credit for this section, despite adding visual interest to the building. And beyond that, you can see the offsets, you can see large windows in a stairwell. All of those were part of the design choices. But on top of that, the larger gray wall didn't meet the code. We were one choice short. So what effectively happened is if you look at those little color pieces, those aren't just siding, those are siding that were forced to actually offset from the building itself. So in other words, it wasn't enough that we just show the color. We had to actually create that articulation. And we negotiated a 6-inch offset down to a 4-inch offset. So we were able, instead of paying $250,000, we paid $150,000. I ask you, if you walk by or drive by that building, if you would agree that that is money well spent. Another section of code is the Northern Climate Weather Protection and Sunlight Menu. It is in 110C6. This section only applies to residential buildings with 8 or more units. So it applies to the least built developments in our city. What we build annually in that category that is required to follow the standards represents 0.05% of our overall housing stock, and much less than that when you put it in context with all building types. My point here is that the overall impact on our city is negligible, but the impact on the feasibility of this use type is substantial. This section has a menu that provides such choices as building a transit stop, providing an ice-free walkway from the city sidewalk to the front door, year-round direct sunlight for every unit. I challenge you to do that. Sun traps, atriums, and protected courtyards. I'll simply say that the features here were envisioned or copied and pasted from communities with very large-scale urban projects, not apartment buildings of 20 units. Finally, major site plan review that kicks in at 2107-110E. There's a site design section. Major site plan review process was a process originally designed for large public projects, a road project, a school, a city facility. The trigger when residential is at least 32 units in 3 buildings or more. It's a lengthy process, expensive, and something that is generally avoided if at all possible. Since 2015, there have been 6 of these applied to residential developments. 3 of those have been Cook Inlet Housing's affordable housing developments. Of the other 3, 2 were due to the special limitations in the zoning, and the third was a Valley developer no longer active building housing in Anchorage. I know of one developer currently who's intentionally downsizing his project to build fewer than 32 units to avoid this requirement, leaving units on the table. The cost of a major site plan review to consultants and fees is in the neighborhood of $60,000. The time frame is 4 to 6 months. It includes a public meeting, a public hearing at the Urban Design Commission. Most importantly, it requires you to fully build your project out to 65%. This means you have substantially completed your civil drawings, your architectural drawings, and your landscaping drawings. There's some mechanical and electrical and structural yet to do, but you have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in the better part of a year, and you don't know if you have a project that will be actually approved. The kicker is all of the things that get reviewed in a major site plan review are things that would get reviewed by staff anyway. This moratorium, I believe, is an effective action and attempt that recognizes that we cannot afford to continue down the current path. We look forward to working with Melissa and her staff, the administration, and the assembly to figure out how to reset our requirements that balance our need to deliver housing responsibly. But this action helps us move the projects that we have in our pipeline forward. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Mr. Robinson, we have a question for you, Ms. Elto.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to look back at this Brewster's picture. I'm kind of going to want to learn, where in the process do you learn that you need something like that? Is that in your pre-application? Is that further down the line when you're already committed into a project? And then are variances readily granted for such things? I mean, this one feels somewhat absurd, but I'm curious, like, were there any other tools to avoid the $25,000 cost, or was it already you're so far down the line, it's just got to happen?
So a little history is that when we had that transition period that Member Constant talked about, where you could pick either code, Cook Inlet Housing willingly said, we'll take it for the team. We'll go first. We'll do a townhouse development. We'll do a multifamily development. We'll see what happens. And our experience in that resulted in some code changes. It also resulted in adding some language in these menu choices that said something like you could get another one. You could satisfy one of these menus with a director approval. So that was language we added directly as a result of our experience. The challenge is since that time, we've had 4 or 5 planning directors, different mayors. It's been very inconsistent. And so I find generally an unwillingness within the sort of bureaucracy to give at least by previous folks in Melissa's seat, a general approval until they see it on a plan. And therefore, my direction to our design team is often not to, hey, spend money to figure out if this counts or not. It is do the same old, same old. We were willing to try some new things here, frankly, because we were tired of building the same building and we had some other opportunities. But I think to your point, it's the burden is often on the developer to prove out whether a proposal meets the intent, which ends up being a very subjective decision at the end of the day.
Can I ask one more question? Thank you. The other question I had is, because of your experience with the multifamily design standards, if we are to pause them for a period of up to 3 years, and the fact that you piloted some of new Title 21 when it came about, what kind of metrics or data do you think we should be looking at during a moratorium or pause that could inform what the action moving forward should be? And I want that from the developer's perspective, because I'm sure there'll be department perspective metrics, but I think it's going to have to be a bit of a partnership in collecting those.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's not one that I've given a lot of thought to. What I'm concerned about, what we've done, what the site access example shows is we've been willing to pass ordinances without understanding what the impact on our development community might actually be. So for starters, if we're proposing something, we're understanding what are the sort of cost or density impacts or whatever those might be. Ultimately, with these things at best, sometimes these things result in higher cost. At worst, they kill a project. And so what we're trying to figure out on our side is, well, how does this impact things? The other thing is, I don't know how you do this. I don't know how you quantify what is most important to the public sector, to the public realm and sort of the general public. And I think we need to do a better job of trying to say, what are we really trying to do? So for example, in site access, I think staff is trying to say, we really are now focused more on that interface of that private to the public realm. That's not how it was originally written. And I think that's, we can sort of live with that because we know we're actually trying to solve a very specific problem. What does design standards mean? I mean, if design standards are important in residential multifamily development or mixed use, why are they not important elsewhere? I mean, I think that if you're worried about where larger density buildings are adjacent to lower density buildings, then that's a very specific situation that you would look at. You wouldn't look at, I've literally had to worry about doing a building and the code has me figure out that it tells me that I'm basically impact my other building that I'm building right next door, but I have control over not impacting that building. I know better than the code does how to not impact that building, right? But it's written in such a way that doesn't even recognize consolidated ownership, for example. So yes, I think it's looking at what the development community needs, what the community needs, but also what we think is going to build more housing at the end of the day.
Right. I have a number of folks in the queue. We are halfway through our time, a little bit over halfway, and we haven't heard from Mr. Debenham, but I'm going to go ahead and go through the queue while we have it. Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. I think you said, Mr. Robinson, that this impacts some projects you guys have already in the pipeline. Can you explain, looking at what you guys are looking at for the next couple building seasons or for perhaps the duration of this pause, what we would get in terms of additional units if this is adopted versus if it isn't?
I mean, our job is to build housing. We're going to try to build housing. I will say that we have, through a variety of, we have a couple of projects that are likely to be triggered by that major site plan review requirement. And potentially, if that section doesn't get paused, we would not be able to start building this summer. We'd have to push off a whole nother year. So we have a direct kind of dog in this fight, if you will. We're looking at about a 5-year pipeline. Cook Inlet Housing's pipeline is somewhere in the neighborhood of, a 20 to 30 unit project per year. To put that into context, we used to build 50 to 100 units a year. And I don't mean to suggest that design guidelines are the reasons why things have changed. When we have 40% cost increases, when we have federal funds that now require that we buy America, there's lots of, when we have interest rates where we're fighting everything, and we are advocating and lobbying everywhere we can where it's appropriate. We're lobbying at the federal level, at the state level. Here, we're lobbying you for what we think you have actual control over and what we can impact. But I think you'd be looking at, it usually takes us a couple of years to put a multi-phase project together. We have about 5 years of projects, potentially in the pipeline somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 units.
So are you saying then that with this change, you expect the 150 units to be built that we would not be seeing but for this moratorium?
I don't think it's that black and white. What I would tell you is, for example, we compete for low-income housing tax credits, which is the biggest affordable housing tool in this country. We compete against communities all over Alaska for those resources. Increasingly, we are having a challenge because already the Mat-Su gets bonus points for building in the Mat-Su because it's deemed to be a higher growth area than Anchorage. So on top of us already starting with a deficit, we're having to deal with some of these costs that actually increase our costs relative to what our competition doing. And the single biggest factor in getting those projects funded is how efficiently someone is using those grant resources. So while I can't say, hey, this goes from 50 to 80, what it is I'm here because it's a very serious risk that we might not be able to move projects in any given year. And this is a part of it.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Boland.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is for Tyler, and then the other is actually for Mr. Downey, who I see in the audience.
So I also just want to be careful
Yep.
to reserve some time for.
I'll go
Mr.
quick.
Brennan.
Yep. I guess, so I'll just say I'm wrestling a little bit with this just because, we have these pictures of your beautiful developments. But I also hear you saying, well, we wouldn't have put X, Y, Z in. We wouldn't have put these windows in. My neighbors really value eyes on the street, that kind of thing. And then we have in the packet that was provided, which is great information for everyone, this letter from Rabbit Creek Community Council, and they have a picture of this building. And this is what my neighbors fear. And I think it's rooted in some actual historical context. And this is what a lot of people have in their minds when they think of multifamily. So if you're saying, we wouldn't have done all these things that we had to do, how can you reassure the public that we're not going from this to this?
It's a good question. For starters, I'm not arguing against eyes on the street. I'm saying that you wouldn't know if my windows were 20% versus 25%. That's what I'm suggesting. We wouldn't not build the window. We would just build it appropriate for what the building was. So I just want to be clear there. The example that came from Rabbit Creek could not be built with these standards struck from code. There's an utter lack of landscaping. Now, could you build a simpler box? Yes, but the site inherent to that absolutely could not be built. So I am frankly growing very tired of people showing me pictures from the 1970s and 80s that say this is what's going to happen if we tweak this one little section of code. Absolutely not. Member Brawley showed you what the code used to be. The code is much more than this one section. The landscaping section alone is, I don't know, it's 40 or 50 pages. 30 pages, 20 pages. My point is that in your neighborhood, and I think the site access proves this out, there's a very clear requirement to push alley access there. So I think that like in some ways, South Addition is the easiest place to fix because we just say, where can the car actually take access on this site? But what I would say is I'm arguing that we have gone too far in one direction and we need to test coming back the other way, but we're not going back to 70s.
No, I appreciate that answer. I think, it's just a complicated thing for me to try to explain to my constituents. that,
Visuals
hey,
matter.
all of this other stuff is in place. My question for Mr. Downey, I guess, 10,000 homes in 10 years. Does the mayor support this legislation? And if so, would she be willing to add her name as a co-sponsor?
Thank you, Graham Downey, for the record, Special Assistant to the Mayor. The answer to the first question is, yeah, absolutely, yes. We're big fans of this legislation. We think it is critical for the 10,000 home strategy, in part based on a lot of the stories we're hearing today. We think this does move the needle. It's sort of at the top of the ask from developers in terms of what's holding us back from adding new units, to Member Johnson's question. So we think this is a big impact. We also, I think, given that it's temporary, right? If it turns out we start building gray boxes, then we can flip the switch back, right? I think it's pretty easy to address potential harms, and it gives us that chance to collect data, which feels really valuable. I haven't asked the mayor about co-sponsoring, but I suspect, well, I don't want to put the answer on the record, but I will ask her about that. It's a good question.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a queue myself, Ms. Brawley, Mr. Salt, but I am just going to pivot to Mr. Debenham so that he gets an opportunity to speak since he's here. Queue will remain, and we'll get to answers and questions after that. Sean.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Sean Debenham from Debenham LLC. As opposed to Tyler, I'm a market rate housing provider. And so I think that's an important distinction because I'm much more sensitive to costs, additional costs, and making it pencil than maybe he is because he has access to funds and grants and other things that I don't have access to. So when we tweak things in here, it affects inherently me more than him. And you can see that played out in the last 15 years. We've built less than 100 market rate apartments in the Anchorage Bowl. Whereas in that same time period, we've actually built quite a few subsidized housing units. So I just say that so that you kind of understand the sensitivity that as a market rate provider that I have on my end. So I've developed pre-new Title 21. I've developed during this current Title 21, and I'm in the process of designing for new units, hopefully that will be coming on this summer. We're looking at doing 107 unit townhome development. Part of that, or most of it, is predicated on some of these changes. So it's important to understand that prior to this new code, to Title 21, there was a housing report done that said that market rate residential housing was not feasible, and that was before Title 21 was implemented. And so at the time, I was at the forefront saying, hey, don't do this. This isn't a good idea. We're not already able to do feasible housing now. So, why are we adding substantial layers of code and requirements on top of that? And sure enough, it got implemented and then nothing happened for the next 12 years, except for just a handful of examples. And so I think it's also important to recognize that, we are experiencing death of housing units by 100 different cuts. And as we backtrack this small segment, it's only backtracking maybe 10 of those 100 cuts. And so people come to me and say, hey, if we now put a moratorium on these residential design standards, how many more units we'll get? Well, it depends how many of the other 90 cuts you're going to cover in addition to the 10 that you're covering with this one ordinance. So you'll probably see me at some of these other ordinances that are also coming up here in the near future that deal with Title 21 and property tax abatement and those types of things. But all of those are trying to deal with these 100 cuts. And this is a great first start. This is a great first start to covering, approximately 10% of those cuts. It's a great start. It's not enough to move the needle all the way, but it's a required first step in that. So with that, I can take questions or anything else or speak to anything else you might like.
I have myself in the queue. Then Ms. Brawley, Mr. Salt. Ms. Brawley said she could go at the end. And so I have a few thoughts. on the communication that we received from the Rabbit Creek Community Council. I really appreciate what you said, Mr. Robinson. Visuals matter. You know, we live in an age of disinformation, misinformation. It's like very interesting times. And when very experienced and skilled and knowledgeable people are putting out information like this and circulating it across broad networks of people, it gets to the point of like, what are we really trying to do here with this bad information? And it seems to me consistently in my neighborhood, it's to cause fear, which is to cause resistance to change. The change that we've had has gotten us here. And we have to do something. So I have a question for the Department of Law to come forward. So the Rabbit Creek Community Council asked for us, instead of using a time-based approach, to use a red line approach, drawing a line around a section of town and picking that area to test the case instead of using the model that was implemented. Can you please provide for us a summary of the legal analysis of the Department of Law?
Sure. This is Quincy Arms with the Department of Law. Basically, our summary is based on case law about spot zoning, which is doing just what you're doing, picking small part of town, picking 1 or 2 properties, picking 4 or 5 property owners, and saying, for you guys, you get special rules. It's arbitrary, it's capricious, it's all the bad things you read about in cases. So that's a basic summary.
Essentially, a conclusion of the Department of Law is it's really not lawful to kind of pick these areas because of all of the reasons highlighted within the memo.
Yeah, and under the Alaska Supreme Court would say per se illegal spot zoning.
Right. And so I just want for folks to understand that the communication that went out, whether it was done in good faith or however it was done, is asking us to do something illegal. I appreciate something about this approach that I think we need to do more of. I've been hesitant to support anything that draws a line around a neighborhood. Even the opportunity zones give me some pause, but they're federally designated. And so it's not us. But the drawing of lines has created neighborhoods that have wanted for infrastructure or not over time. And so we know in Alaska, very specifically in Anchorage, very specifically in District 1, that those decisions are harmful. But this approach instead is to bound it in time as opposed to bound it within a red line that subjects one area with a certain set of policies as opposed to another. And so I believe that the sponsors have achieved something that's really elegant, despite what we have heard from people in one community council shared with others, that this would be a 3-year abandonment, a gamble with a 3-year abandonment of residential design standards. That's predicated on the fear that houses will crop up, multi-unit houses will crop up like mushrooms in all parts of town. Doesn't work that way. These projects are big and expensive. And so I appreciate that the sponsors have come up with a nuanced approach. And I think we need to do more of this, which is the one thing we can experiment with is put it in place, see what it does. And then when the time is over, analyze what it did. And then if it did something bad, we know. And if it did something good, we do more of that. And so I just want to thank the sponsors for this approach. And I thank you to the Department of Law for your analysis of that question, because it could be easy to fall down this road of we want to do this because this very knowledgeable and experienced community council set of leaders who know what they're doing have circulated this communication. So I just want to put that out there. And that's probably not really a question. I think I have Miss Zalatel and then Miss Brawley in the queue if anyone else. Oh, Mr. Salt, I'm sorry, I skipped you. You're right, Mr. Salt, then Miss Brawley, then Miss Salt. Go ahead.
So I'm just going to ask the question maybe a little bit differently. What are the odds of these changes having impact to lots that are on well and septic?
I don't think I'm prepared to, that's not where I'm looking to buy land. So be someone else. I will say, I think most of these standards don't apply already to units of 4 or fewer units. So assuming that, they've essentially already been suspended for, 1 to 4 unit developments. I think the thinking there was because, again, they were designed at this scale and the design standards were really not appropriate for smaller projects.
Yeah, it won't affect them at all, honestly.
So, wait, but can you put a little nuance on that? That was a very definitive statement. Why?
Because I can't build multifamily development on a well and septic system that's in locations in Anchorage where they have those. So here in Midtown, for example, we don't have well and septic, or that I would be putting in. I'd be using the public well and septic, so I think what Assemblyman Salt's getting at is that it's typically single-family houses on the hillside, and that's not areas where residential multifamily would typically go in. It'd be very, I mean, nothing's impossible, but it'd be very difficult to put a multifamily large development on the hillside like that.
And as an example, like Girdwood, like they're just trying to put in an eightplex or something. What are they having to do? Anyway, what are they having to do?
But again, yeah, and Girdwood this doesn't apply, so.
But my point is
your
they're having
point
to
is-
stub in massive pipes for the water, getting federally designated spending so that it can become affordable. Right, that gets to the impossibility of the kind of scenario. Thank you. Other questions? Salt? Thank you, Ms. Zalatil.
Thanks. As we've been having, excuse me. As we've been having this conversation, I actually ran back and consulted with planning and legal, and I wanted to make sure I was right, but this does apply to the rehabilitation of 5+ units. So if you think vacant and abandoned properties, if those were to be rehabilitated, unless they have existing non-conforming rights or a variance is granted. And the reason I asked that is we've been talking a lot about new construction, but we've also, as a body, made considerable investments in vacant and abandoned property rehabilitation. So I just wanted to get that on the record because it hasn't been a focus of this. Thank you.
So, Ms. Bell, you want to go last? I have another concern, or you can go now. Okay. So something that was stated, I think I want to make sure we're really clear on that. You said, Mr. Debenham, in Midtown, there are no wells. That is not exactly true, right? And so I want folks to recognize we in fact have an ordinance before us on Tuesday about wells, and there are many, many, many of them within the urban areas of town. But they just generally can't service this kind of infrastructure. So I want the record to be really clear. We do have wells and little utilities all over town. Spinard has a number of them. Midtown has a number of them. And so that, Ms. Brawley.
Thanks. I just wanted to add 2 quick things. One is just really bringing it back to the fact that this applies to some types of housing. I presented on January 22nd with former Assembly Member John Weddleton. He pointed out that at some point there were also commercial design standards in code that have been removed. So I think that's worth noting that we have decided that the impacts to feasibility for commercial were enough that we already removed those from code, and we have never made that decision on housing. Again, this is a pause. This is not a removal, but that decision has already been made. The other one is just at our meeting last month, we as a body, I think unanimously voted to permanently remove or exempt the standards for these buildings in B3. So I think the question, and we've had this ongoing conversation about the fact that it's easier to build in our business zones than it is to build in any of our residential zones, the type of housing that we need. So that decision has already been made. Those are permanently gone. And so really the question is, again, this is not deleting those things, but the question is what makes multifamily housing different enough that we treat it differently than commercial buildings, and what makes these standards different enough in residential zones that we are okay with having already removed them in business zones. So I think it's just something that I want to put on the table. Thanks.
Right. So we have a few more minutes, maybe 6. I don't know. Anyone?
I want to say one.
Ms. Zalatil.
Thank you. So one of the floor amendments that's being contemplated for Tuesday night is a working group. And I think if a working group is in fact contemplated by the AO, that working group should probably, or in standing up that working group, that members should think about if an amendment is run, what are the data parameters that they would like to see collected. This is our opportunity to weigh in. What would be useful to know about the effectiveness of the moratorium? I collected a little bit from what Mr. Robinson said. I'm sure the planning department will have some additional metrics they may want to put forward. But in the end, I think if a working group is going to be stood up, it needs to be evaluating data that we as policymakers find useful in deciding whether or what multifamily design standards should be put back into place, throughout the time that's being examined. And so often we choose to make policy decisions, but we don't think what the further out policy decision is. I won't be here. I have some metrics I would love to suggest for you all, but this decision will be coming back before the body in, a year, 2 years, 3 years. And so I really think the upfront thinking now about today's conditions, and it doesn't mean that new metrics couldn't be collected later. So I hope to create a floor amendment with Ms. Brawley that really leaves open the ability to add more to it on the floor Tuesday night. So if you have those ideas, or if you have those ideas in advance and you can send them to Matthew and Dean, then we can try to be as inclusive as possible. Thank you.
Bronca.
I appreciate that. So can we get back to the gray uglies building? In a nutshell, you say this can't happen anymore. And I think I'm one of those people who are very triggered by 80s build because I live in it. But if you look at that building, what couldn't be done now? What would this have to look like right now?
Through the chair to Ms. Bronga, thank you for the question. I'd have to look at the site itself to say exactly what could or could not be done now. But just based on that photo, I believe that the parking arrangement would be impossible now. I believe that it would require landscape around the site, and it would require site enhancement landscaping. And then also, I can't remember if there's a dumpster in the photo, but there still would be dumpster screening requirements in place after this moratorium is in place. So with the moratorium in place, that arrangement that you see in the photo would still be impossible.
So the building itself, I mean, dumpster amenities, maybe some landscaping, but the big box would be okay?
The big box
With a crazy
itself,
little entryway cover?
it is possible that that might be the case. I'd have to look at the building as well. But you'll also note that we do have Title 23, and I don't think that that building would meet Title 23 requirements, which this moratorium is not touching at all.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, I mean, the one thing I'd add, there are protections in zoning, many protections that would remain, but I would also suggest that there are lots of protections in the marketplace as well. If you are going to build a new construction building, you are going to lease that building at a much higher rent than what is surrounding in the property. You have to. Sean will tell you that you have to, or you don't have a viable project. He's not going to build that and rent it out for $1,800, whatever the number is. So just understand that there are market forces here, which I think was part of what the commercial reasons for dropping some of this is. I'm not going to build Class A office space that I need Class A rents and not make the building look like it's a Class A office building.
So I will have some last comments then. Looking at this photograph again in that communication, I can't quite determine if it's in Fairview or if it's in Midtown, kind of a section between Arctic and C Street. I work in one place and kind of lived forever in another. And it could be in East Anchorage too. There are probably a couple pockets. And in my district, this property was built as a response to restrictive zoning. This happened because of the highway system and because those people go over there. That's where these units are. We need to do the thing around our homes. So I have just some thoughts that a lot of people are frustrated with housing policy. We see people unhoused. We see people marginally housed because our housing stock is falling apart. We see professionals unable to find a home because there's nowhere to buy or move. some call these efforts Hail Mary efforts, that they don't give any recognition to reasonable expectations or adopted plans and limits of infrastructure. But the reality is, we even sat here on this one today. Mr. Salt asked the question, are we going to see this on the wells and septics, which is code for higher up in the mountains and kind of, no, we're not, because it can't be done. People suggest that we would do building at all costs. I've never seen that happen in this body. It's a red herring to suggest that we would. People suggest that we should be asking people why things are the way that they are as a defense to how things are the way that they are. And I think we have a challenge to face, that things are the way they are because advocates made them the way that they are. And they frankly aren't all that good right now. And so what can we continue to do in small bites, measurable bites, so people can understand it, to tackle this challenge? And so I am so grateful for the brave sponsors who continue to do this work in the face of the waves of information that come out. They get very personal to you. And it's not fair. You know, there's an old adage, and I'll end now, this time is about out, that if you don't like the idea, you fight the idea. And if you can't win in the battle of ideas, you tackle the process. And if you can't win in the argument of the process, you attack the person. And so I won't stand for people being attacked on this body for the hard work that they're doing to solve these problems. This is great work. So I'm told by my vice chair, it's time to adjourn. So we'll now adjourn and take up another work session in about 10 minutes. Thank you.